Are there any parts of fitness and nutrition outside of carbs are bad that you don't think are intuitive or common sense to people if they were to think hard enough?
I think the whole understanding of fat loss and cardio is a big one, because people think that moving more burns more calories and therefore you need to move more and eat less. Like that's the common mantra, right? When in reality, our bodies are very adaptive. So the more you move, especially past a certain point of intensity, like with running or some sort of intense cardio, the more your body gets a signal that, hey, this mode of movement is important for you. And so I'm going to conserve energy for it and become really good at it. And so if you become good at running, guess what happens? You burn fewer calories. Now, I'm not saying you burn fewer. I'm saying the increase is less and less.
As a percentage of
As a percentage.
Yeah.
So long story short, you don't have to do much cardio. You do have to train by lifting weights. And then you have to use nutrition to moderate the change in weight.
How do young men like us optimize our lives in a way that lets us achieve success and meaning? Come with me as I interview top performers and delve into key areas of life: habits, finance, psychology, health, relationships, work, creativity, and business. I boil the ocean of men's advice into usable wisdom in this podcast to give you the answers. My name is Blake Bottrell, and this is the Distilled Podcast. My guest today can only be described as the meta-analysis of fitness and nutrition podcasts. The podcast he started from his closet and home gym in 2020 has amassed over 150,000 listens in 3 years. The self-described fitness skeptic is on a mission to fill the gaps of healthy living with the science of why. No more personal trainers telling you because I said so. Philip Pape, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Blake. That was the best intro I've ever had. You know, it was concise, but it was so original. So thank you.
We work on it a little bit.
Yeah.
So I've been taught my whole life that targeted fat burn is a myth. And you were part of some recent research that says that might not be true. Can you unpack that for me? And do we have to give the Fitfluencers a W on this one?
So are you referring to Dr. Campbell's study that I was a contributor to?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So just to be totally clear on that, the study that he reviewed, I had no participation in whatsoever. And the question that I answered was specifically about how to develop your abs, independent of whatever that study said. I'm skeptical, and many others are still skeptical about whether that can happen or not. And if you look at the study, they didn't really account for nutrition very well. So right there, it throws a huge wrench in the process. So my preference for most folks is to focus on the things that actually matter, and that's training, nutrition, the big rocks, right? Or not stepping over, stones to pick up pennies in your one of your recent blog articles. Yeah.
Yeah. Don't trip over dollars to pick up pennies.
There you go. I figured I'm trying to pull it out of my brain here.
Speaking of which, you referenced, or at least I think you referenced, one of my newsletters in your Instagram post this morning. You talked about non-zero days. What does a non-zero day look like for you, and why is that important?
Yeah, I think a non-zero day is just showing up and not letting excuses derail you is what it comes down to. I mean, I see it every day with my clients and even myself. I'm going through a recovery from shoulder surgery last year, and occasionally there's setbacks where 10 things happen all in 1 week, and you're like, why even bother, right? Like, why even bother? And really, most people are doing very little. And so if you can do something, it's going to be a lot more than that. And I'm not saying do that every day and do it every week, but every day have a minimum that you hit, based on the context.
Yeah, that's James Clear's big thing, is making the habit too small to fail, right? So even if it's you put your running shoes on and you walk out the door and you walk for 5 minutes, or you drive to the gym and you walk in and you do 10 push-ups and you leave. Like the hard part is getting through the door. And once you're there, nobody actually does 10 push-ups and leaves, but the getting over the initial friction of getting through the door is what usually gets people to the next stage anyways.
Yeah, and that initial friction. And so it's interesting. Atomic habits comes up all the time in this context. And we have to break it up into different phases, right? Because there's the initial stickiness of a habit that's challenging to get to. And one of the things that trips us up is for example, trying to go after too many habits at once. Even if you're doing it quote unquote perfectly, if you try to go after 50 new habits in week one, that's a place that trips you up. Another is you're trying to develop a habit that's just the wrong habit, right? Like if you think fat loss and body composition comes from doing lots of cardio, and then you start doing lots of cardio and you're super disciplined, and it doesn't give you the result, you just, sort of wasted all that time developing the wrong habit. So I could go on, but like psychology is a massive part of this. And when people say, how do you get motivated? My main response is take one small step to get the right win. The win then motivates you to take the next one. And that's my favorite way of building habits.
I think honestly, motivation is kind of like a dirty word for me at this point. It's like,
sure,
it doesn't actually exist.
Self-motivation.
Yeah. Everything you really just need to. And I love, okay, maybe you had this thing that I heard you were talking about moving from like motivation and discipline to like appreciation instead. And that for me is much better fuel than like motivation's total bullshit. Discipline is if you have the self-directive to actually get there, sure. Not a lot of people have that, especially in the beginning. So I think that appreciation thing is good early fuel to get you over that hump to where you're starting to form that habit and the discipline is coming in.
Yeah, man. There's so many different personalities too, right? So many different. I mean, what works for one doesn't work for another. And we can talk principles to the cows come home, and we could say, yeah, read James Clear's book. And then when it comes to actual practice, and the rubber meets the road, it's going to be different for everyone. And some people might just quote unquote hate doing something. They hate working out, and then we have to dig into the emotions and psychology behind it of like, well, do you really hate working out, or do you hate how you're working out and what working out gives you, and on and on and on. And you mentioned friction earlier. Like if we think of it as a seesaw or a scale where friction's on one side and action's on the other, if the friction's just too big, no amount of action is going to overcome that. So you're right. Like focusing on both sides is helpful.
If I'm looking to build a home gym that's 100 and 150 square feet, what are my options? Give me like the three, like cheap but sufficient, the gets me 80% of the way there, and then the luxury stuff that you'd put in the gym if you could.
Oh man, what's your goal? That's what I would ask. What's your goal?
Okay. Lowering the friction to start my workout, getting this whole podcast could just turn into we're going to give Blake a free virtual training session here. But I think the goal for me is lowering the friction, like slight body recomposition. I don't need to lose. I'm like skinny fat and would just ideally like to, whenever I think about where I want to be in my fitness journey, I always come back to Peter Attia's like marginal decade thing, where he's talking about how you want to live at the end of your life. And like, I've not fully embraced the term functional fitness as a concept, but like being able to do things well later in life. So just building a base level of strength. I don't need to look like a bodybuilder or anything. Like that's not the end goal.
Yeah, I get it. And I'm glad that you tied functional, which is another dirty word for a lot of people, with strength and muscle. And I would say for a lot of us, there's a lot of muscle mass you could go after, but the minimum, going back to minimums, is just not losing all the muscle we have, which is what happens when you're not pushing yourself. So having established that we care about longevity and body composition and overall health, we're going to want to lift to build strength and muscle. You need some sort of resistance training. Therefore, your home gym has to be set up for a progression over time and some sort of sustainable forecast of using that gym for years to come. Can you use dumbbells? Can you use bands? Can you use body weight? Yes, initially, but you're going to tap out on that pretty quickly. Even like a 70-year-old female who's never lifted before, she might get pretty strong on her deadlift if she actually, applies the principles. And so, you need a rack, you need a bar, you need plates. So for me, small square footage, it doesn't take a lot of space to have a power rack, a bar, and plates, and a bench. So that's what I would invest in. You could be scrappy and probably get away with like a couple grand for all of that for used equipment at most. Or if you have money, then the sky's the limit.
For sure. What's the consensus on the all-in-one machines, like the Bowflexes of the world versus like an actual power rack?
Do you know how rarely I've had that question? No, I've like people almost never ask that question. I used to have a Bowflex, like the original, back in the early 2000s. Because I'm in my 40s, and that thing was a clothes hanger. If I had it in my room right now, though, I'd be curious to see like what it allows you to do, because I remember it had a pulley system, so you could do like flies and some sort of quasi squats, I guess. Anyway, the question is, okay, I don't like them personally, unless we're talking about like those big functional trainers that have like dual cable machines and then pull up bars and racks and stuff. But then you're just combining like traditional stuff with cables. I would just keep it simple and go for the rack and bar.
Okay, give me the thinly veiled pitch for Macro Factor and why it's better than MyFitnessPal, everything else. And most importantly, what is the one point that we're trying to arrive at when we're talking about tracking calories and tracking macros?
Oh boy, I mean, you have researched me. Okay, so the thinly veiled pitch, because I'm an affiliate, my code is Wits and Weights. The thinly veiled pitch is that it can do something that those other apps don't do or don't do well, and that is dynamically adjust to your metabolism. That is the main selling point. If you start tracking your food and you track your weight, there's an algorithm in that app that says, okay, here's how your weight is trending and here's what you're eating. Therefore, you're probably burning about this many calories per day. And therefore, on Monday, when we adjust your calories and macros, it'll match that. That's huge. The prerequisite to that, which you implied with your second half of your question, why should we track, I think, or what's the
tracking? One goal that we're trying to arrive at when we're tracking everything?
Okay. It's multiple goals, but it depends on the phase. I guess I'll say when you start tracking, the goal is awareness. And that's massive. Like, and if you get no other goal out of it, that's the one that I think is the game changer for most people. I've had clients who are the most disciplined folks who train, have lots of muscle mass. They train, they do everything under the sun for their health. And yet they did diets rather than tracking. And there was always this rebellion, in their head, this rebellion against tracking because it's tedious or whatever other assumption you're making about it. And then they started to track, and literally within a week or two, you start to know, here's how much I'm eating, here's what I'm eating, here's the quality, here's the micros, macros, and so on. So that would be the main thing. The second thing would be to go after a specific body composition goal. So if you want to know that I need to gain X pounds or lose X pounds, that's going to get you there as precisely and time efficiently as possible, which I don't like to waste time, man. To me, that's just why bother?
That's a fair categorization. I think when I look at my fitness journey, I'm not trying to map it in a time horizon. I'm like, how can I look at this longitudinally over the entirety of my life? So when it gets into tracking and stuff like that for me, like I would never use tracking as a way to like go through some sort of cycle to hit some sort of body composition goal. It would just be track over time just to know where I am. But it's interesting that you bring up the awareness thing, because for me, and I know we might get into some of this later, but I can almost guarantee that I'm consistently under eating by several hundred calories based on the fact that I have defaulted into intermittent fasting for almost my entire life. Mm-hmm. I just don't eat breakfast. So for all the research that there is on intermittent fasting that people talk about it, the biggest thing is it's just the chances that you're eating enough calories as a result of the fact that you're intermittent fasting is just less because you're skipping a meal.
That's the main benefit of it.
So I'm almost consistently under eating calories, and it's finding that awareness from tracking. When I did do it briefly previously, it's like, oh, I should be eating like 400 to 500 more calories a day sometimes, depending on what my meals look like.
Yes. And you find out the breakdown of those calories too, of whether most people are underfed on their protein. And man, if you want to live a long life and build muscle, at some point you're going to want to not be in that perpetual state of dieting. Plus it feels better usually to be eating more food, and your hormones love it and all that. But going back to one thing you said about the time horizon, for people who are maintaining their weight or gaining, I totally agree. You could take a looser approach to that, and it's not that big a deal. Again, if you're going after maximum muscle gain, it does help to know a very precise rate to do that at, or else you're going to gain too much fat that has to come off later, or you're just not going to gain muscle as quickly, which again may not be important to you. On fat and fat loss, I think there's another argument to be made for tracking, and that is to avoid it taking longer than it needs to. That's the key. I don't want me or my clients to be dragging it on and being in that hormonally depressed state and psychologically depressed state of like, oh God, nobody likes dieting, man. It's not a fun thing to do, right? So that would be the other argument.
For sure. I heard you mention in a TikTok video that you're not necessarily a fan of meal delivery services in the pre-prepped sort of the factors or the meals or the whatever of the world. Is there something specifically there? Is it just additives? Are we worried about where the food has been, or is it just, I guess the question is there another mechanism there that we should be worried about versus prepping the food ourselves?
Man, TikTok. So I tried TikTok like a year and a half ago, and then I haven't been on it ever since. So this must have been one of my early videos. I said I didn't like meal prep services because now now I'm questioning
it. You didn't like food delivery services as in pre-prepped meals. So stuff where you weren't cooking it yourself.
I would have to look at that and see. I don't remember saying that, to be honest. I'm actually okay. I took a very flexible approach. So if I did say that, maybe I was just getting started in my coaching and didn't know what I was talking about. I am fine with whatever gets you to your goal and satisfies your lifestyle mainly. And yeah, so I've actually recommended that to clients too. Interesting. Man, you caught me. I don't know. I have to go find that TikTok video now.
There you go. It's an idea that like I've been playing around with because I like reframing ideas sometimes. So the idea that I've been playing around with is like, I can get high quality meal prep food to my house for my wife and I for like less than 30 grand a year, which in my head, the reframe is I can get a private chef to cook all my meals for lunch and dinner for less than 30 grand, which is when you think about it, the time that you're spending for a lot of people, obviously you'd have to have the ability to afford that. But I think people assume that their options are limited when it comes to eating healthy food. So I would just encourage people to play around with the things that you're maybe not thinking about.
I love the creativity, and it sounds like the reframe is in your mind. You were trying to think of it as almost a rationalization, but it doesn't have to be, right? It's perfectly fine. Like, again, it's up to you to meet your goals that way, and it's convenient. So if the alternative is you're going to eat fast food or you're not going to eat or whatever, it's all about comparisons.
I like this model of creating a board of directors in your mind that you reference on specific topics or take advice from. If you had to create a personal board of directors for yourself in the fitness world, who do you think would be there?
Oh, that's a good one. So actual names here. I would definitely have on there Dr. Eric Helms. I would have Alan Aragon, Eric Trexler. How many names do you want? Because I could probably list 6 or 7.
I don't know. How many are on a board of directors? 6 to 8 usually, probably?
There's probably a lot. I would put Greg Nuckols on there. Bill Campbell, for sure. Dr. Bill Campbell. And I feel like there's one other I'm missing. Let's say Andy Morgan.
Is there anything about those guys that sticks out to you? Obviously, I don't want you to run through 8 guys, but something that sticks out to you as a piece of advice from them that you reference often?
In generalities, all of them share the similar principles of doing what works for you and not trying to optimize everything when you're not there yet, right? So like optimal's fine, but in general, people overthink all the evidence. They overthink the, flip-fluencers are saying, whether it's about seed oils or carbs or whatever. And most people are just not doing the basics. Again, going back to the pennies versus the dollars. So that would be the general advice. I mean, I could give specifics from different people if you want me to go there. But
go for it. Let's go for it.
I mean, so like Dr. Eric Helms, right? He's been on my show twice. He's a great guy. I mean, you could probably get him on. He's very generous with his time. He takes an extremely practical approach to macros, for example. He himself, he just got his pro card as a natural bodybuilder, and he's always tracked except recently, like in the past year or two, because he's built this skill of knowing, like, he could just look at a plate and practically know what he's eating. And so he said, most people aren't ready to do that, but you can eventually. But if you're trying to hit targets, don't try to hit exact targets, because perfectionism is usually the thing that trips us up. We're trying to be so precise. but we're humans. Food is food. It's not like you can, measure it down to the gram and the exact macro. So why don't you hit minimums, give yourself a lot of leeway, and know that there's no such thing as like, optimizing for the leucine threshold that's going to get you some massive, advantage over just getting all your protein every day.
I love that. You keep referencing this newsletter, but I'm a big fan of not trying to over engineer the last 10 to 20% of everything that we're doing. So just making sure that you're hitting those basics, like you said, hydration, protein, sleep, all that good stuff, fiber, worrying about everything else on the back end, and just taking the very minimal approach to getting people started in their journey. Because this keeps coming back on every podcast I'm listening to, but the average person in the US is overweight, divorced, and has less than $1,000 in the bank account. So if you just do better than that, you're doing better than half of the people in the States right now. So
yeah, exactly. If you just do better than that, and then you said like doing the minimum. I mean, how do I like to think of it? I feel like there's something behavioral psychology or a positive psychology called upward spiraling. You heard of that concept, upward spiraling, where one thing leads to another is the easiest way to put it. But specifically, they've studied this in the context of human happiness and all the things that are associated with happiness in our life, which being humans, that is our physical self, our mental self, our emotions, our relationships, and so on. And so any one of those things that you kind of just step change on with this minimum change from nothing, like most Americans, to something, all of a sudden just magically starts to eke into everything else. Now, I do like taking a priority-based approach, like what's the first thing? And that's going to be based on either the thing that's closest to you and easiest to get, or the biggest red flag for you. It could be one or the other. It's kind of like the strengths, weaknesses, where do I leverage my strength to make it a little better, or do I try to fill a gap? And you could take both approaches. But I find number one for most people is just training effectively. And then that leads to, oh, well, now I'm training right. And I feel like I need more carbs for my morning session because, I'll train even better. And then, oh, maybe I should walk a little more over here because that increases my metabolism. And then I could eat more. And it kind of spirals into all these other things. Right. And then your mental health and everything else. So I don't know. I rambled on that, but there you go.
what does training effectively look like for you, knowing that everybody is slightly different?
Yeah, I like how you said that. So knowing that everybody's different, we have to think of principles and not methods, right? There's many methods, principles are few. So the main principle of training is training hard. And that's a very nebulous statement. So for me, training hard is training with proximity to failure so that you get mechanical tension on your muscles. That's a primary principle. To do that, or once you do that, your body can adapt, get stronger, and allow you to lift more next time. And there we have principle number 2, which is progressive overload. So proximity to failure and progressive overload, pretty much with those two things, you can train effectively for the rest of your life.
Is there anything in the research that you're aware of as far as the fatigue point at which muscle building occurs? I've heard so many varying things that I just figured I'd ask. Obviously, literally one rep is going to do something, but there is probably an optimal proximity to failure that we want to try to achieve. And this will probably lead into a next question of my eternal mode of being at the gym is, am I just a bitch, or is this actually where I should be stopping?
Yeah, no, that science has been studied extensively, and people get all hot and bothered and try to get into the minutia as usual. But the simple answer is for bigger lifts, like compound lifts, like squats and deadlifts, around 2 reps from failure, 2 to 3 reps is usually optimal, unless you're pushing a max, which is a different goal. And then for smaller or isolation movements, 0 to 1. That's it. And now principles, you can do that at 5 reps or you can do that at 20 reps. Okay. Now that leads me to the second theory a lot of people talk about. It's the effective reps model. This is where, okay, if I do 15 reps, the first like 11 are junk. And so rather than do 15 reps, either go heavier or do an intensity technique that forces you to like take less rest period or something like that, where you fatigue the muscles and have less volume, but you're hitting those effective reps faster. I think the science is mixed on that to where it doesn't really matter as much. What matters is just that you get to those reps somehow.
So if you prioritize time, as we've been talking about, just lift heavy.
Yes, lift heavy and use intensity techniques and supersets, and you can really get a short workout session. Yeah.
I think I posted a tweet a couple months ago that was something to the effect of like, imagine how fast your workout would be if you didn't have to take 5 minutes in between every set to like booty picks or something. It's like,
true. But hey, so here's the thing: if you lift really heavy, you actually have to take long rest periods.
Yeah.
So then you're kind of back to that. It's like you can take short rest periods with more reps or longer with exactly.
So like back to that previous question of, am I just a bitch? How do I know? Because a lot of training programs are built on like percentage of 1 rep max, say. How do I safely find out where my 1 rep max is in a given exercise to begin a program or something like that?
Yeah, there's a couple ways to do that. That's a great question, actually. If you've been lifting and you just are trying new movements out, I would use something like the RPE scale, which is rate of perceived exertion, which is like a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is no reps left in the tank. That's your max exertion, and 1 is the opposite. So you would go for something like an 8 or a 9, which gets you to like 1 or 2 reps shy of failure. And that's more of a feel, which is tough for a beginner. But I'm saying if somebody who's already been lifting, I would start there. And now you've got something to baseline from to progress, because all you're going to do from there, Blake, is go up. So, I mean, you can hit 8.5, 9.5 RPE potentially on the upcoming sessions, and then you know how to dial it back. For a beginner, all I like to do is program everything with sets across, meaning like 3x5 or 5x5 or 1x5, not rep ranges. And that way, your very first session, maybe it's an empty bar. Maybe it's 10-pound plates. Maybe it's super light and you're just practicing form. But then your next session, no matter what, you're going to add weight to that bar. And then the next session, add weight to that bar. Every single session, because you're a beginner and you can recover extremely quickly and you will adapt. In fact, if you don't do it that frequently enough, you may not push yourself enough to adapt. So you will figure out what heavy is soon enough doing it that way.
That's interesting. I've heard you briefly touch on this, but can you talk about the mechanism of like faster recovery and greater strength gains as a beginner or someone looking to get into resistance training? I think this is an important point because for a lot of people, part of the resistance to going to the gym is they're like, oh, this is going to take 6 months before I see any results. And while that is definitely the case, for someone who's literally never lifted before, you're actually probably going to see results faster than that.
Very fast, very fast. I mean, within a few months. Like I would say there's a phase called neuromuscular adaptation, right? And then there's the hypertrophy phase. So neuromuscular adaptation is your body just programming itself and your brain and your nerves to understand this movement pattern. So that's why I don't like you changing your programming up constantly. Stick with the same lifts, ideally the same lifts almost every session as a beginner. Like don't do these 4-day or 5-day splits. Just do full body 3 days a week, squat, deadlift, some sort of press. That's all you need. Maybe throw a row in there. As a beginner, the stress recovery adaptation cycle is super fast. So you're stressing yourself with something your body's never experienced before. Just like when you go out in the sun and you get exposed to sun and your body browns or over browns, which is called burning and turning red, like some of those pale guys get. And in the gym, so you go in Monday, Wednesday, you can definitely lift more. What most people do, Blake, is they just they're like, okay, I'm gonna do a set of 10, then I'm gonna do a set of 10, then I'll do a set, and it's the same weight, as if that's somehow exercising or it is exercising, but it's not training. It's not training to progress. So I would say 3 to 6 up to 9 months is the beginner phase where you can do that, after which you're up in the pretty heavy weights that cause you to have to reduce the frequency at which you go up, to like twice a week down to once a week, and then eventually once every few weeks.
If I'm looking at this sort of longitudinal arc and working on building muscle to get to healthy physique, or I don't want to say athlete's physique, but that requires the point of this question. Is there a point at which I can, instead of having to do what people would typically refer to as like a bulk and cut cycle, is there a world where you can start as a beginner and just see a steady over time increase in strength and weight or body composition readjustment, or however you want to frame that.
Sure, I'll use a phrase: body recomposition. Body recomposition, right? Yeah, absolutely. It's totally possible. I would say don't go into a slight diet when you're brand new and be in at least a slight surplus. If you have to ask yourself if you're a bitch, though, no, I'm just kidding. You know the answer. I'm just kidding. I've worked with a lot of clients who did that for a while, and then they're like, I'm kind of in no man's land here because my lifts are going up, but I'm starting to see missed reps here and there. Things are starting to stall, and my body composition's slightly improving, but not like I want. And so I still am an advocate for a cycle or two, like maybe 2 years of bulks and cuts, which is probably 2 cycles of each. That's it. It's like a 9-month bulk, a 3-month cut, another 9-month bulk, 3-month cut. And now you've shortcutted the time it takes to get to a decent body composition that you can then maintain with whatever format you want. Having said all that, a brand new person, yes, they can body recomp if they train really hard and stay in a very tiny surplus. The exception is, a good exception is if you are very overweight, you can probably lose fat and weight on the scale while you build muscle because your body is effectively providing a reserve of energy via the fat source. So it perceives it as still being in a slight surplus. It's kind of a crazy phenomenon. And then the other scenario is somebody who's detrained. So they used to train years ago. I had a client like this when he was a teenager. He was like into bodybuilding. You see his photos, you're like, man, he looks great. And then he let it go over the next 20 years, right? And he was like 250 pounds at 5'7". For him, we just went into a pretty aggressive diet because a detrained person, their muscle response is massive when they start training again.
I like the reframe to save time. That's kind of a fun idea there. I'd never thought of it that way, in that like you're going to arrive at the same place, but why not arrive at the body that you want 3 years ahead of when you could otherwise? I guess it comes down to the perceived amount of time that it takes to track as much as you would need to effectively go through a bulk cut cycle. Is there a biggest thing that you find people are overestimating or underestimating when it comes to the tracking of different metrics that would be required to effectively do that? Like, are people, when they begin one of these cycles, say starting from fresh, is it more often in that their nutrition is off? Is it more often that their perceived strength is not where they think it should be to start with? Is it that they're undercounting sleep? Like, where are we starting from?
If I had to pick one, it would be the nutrition for sure. I feel like training is more straightforward once you explain it. You give somebody a program, they do the movements, and then they get a little feedback along the way, and then they're there. They get there. The nutrition side is trickier just because there's so much baggage people have. Usually when I get them at the age of 35, 40 or older, of having diet, and men and women, okay? Nobody is immune from having dieted many times and heard so much crap from the fitness industry. It doesn't make sense if you knew the evidence, but you think it's the opposite of what it is. Like carbs make you fat, stuff like that. I can go through all the myths, but it's that. And so going back to what we mentioned earlier of just tracking for awareness, I would suggest the first 2 months of this process is just a learning process. That's all it is. It's learning and then doing that, expanding that comfort zone just slightly, like we talked about with the tiny habits, one thing after another. If you had to pick one habit that most people are going to have the biggest benefit from, it's adding protein to every meal and then adding fiber to every meal. And that's it. Like just that alone is massive for most people to feel better, to feel more satiated, to start getting a response to their muscle and so on.
I want to give people a quick hack on that if they have the ability to. I stumbled across this in another podcast because that's all I do is listen to podcasts and watch YouTube videos. But I discovered a couple of months back hydrolyzed protein, which is basically just protein with all the fats and sugar stripped out. But what happens is it mixes a lot better with water versus having to mix it with like a milk or something. And you can get it because there's no fats in it. They often like to make them like a fruitier flavor or a fresh flavor. So it basically tastes like juice. So I've been switching a lot of my protein quote unquote shakes to that, and I'll just take that to the gym with me, and I just drink juice during my workout, and it's 20 to 30 grams of protein depending on how much I put in it, and it feels great. It's way easier to get protein than trying to drink a milkshake twice a day.
Dude, this is a great example of where if you just came to me with a question and I didn't know you and you said, what's better, hydrolyze or just the regular isolate? And I would say not the hydrolyze, right? Like don't do the hydrolyze for a number of reasons. I think it's more expensive too.
It
I
definitely
forget,
is more expensive, but
yeah, it's more expensive, right? And I'm like, it doesn't matter if I didn't know you. But then if you said, this thing tastes fruity, I love it, I look forward to it, I'm going to get my protein, that's the one for you. Like that's a great example of that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think a lot of people, when you talk about just eat more protein, everybody struggles to eat more protein because obviously, like you say, it's the most satiating. And when you try to do it in powder form, you're basically drinking a milkshake. And it's like, it's hard to get the amount of protein, even like the recommended daily minimum from even a lot of the government stuff, which is like potentially half of what the actual recommended daily minimum should be. So it just one sort of piece of advice, if I could give people, if you're struggling to get your protein in and you feel like a beverage would be easier, go with that.
Yeah, there's so many hacks like that. And again, if we were to bring it back to principles, when someone says, "Oh, it's hard to get my protein," first, I want to make sure you know that you're getting X amount of protein versus what you want to be getting. And then second, meal planning. Like this is it's you've heard it a million times, and it's like, oh, there they go again, nutrition guy talking about meal planning. First of all, I don't use meal plans ever for people. In fact, now I use AI. If somebody wants to create a meal plan, I say, go use AI. I'll show you how to do it. Like you just say, here are my macros, give me a meal plan, here's what I like. It'll do it way better than any human. Okay. So I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not a dietitian. I'm a nutrition coach. I want to coach you how to do this for yourself. So if you can't get enough protein, I'll say, well, let's map out tomorrow. Like let's map out your 5 meals or your 3 meals and one snack for tomorrow. And as soon as you start playing the game of Tetris with your macros, you figure out pretty quickly it's not enough protein. Then we just play the game of, pick and choose. We have meat column, we have the egg column, we have the dairy column, we have the plant-based, protein, and we have the powders. That's it. Once you kind of get that list going, and you know what's more dense than the other, you get kind of advanced. You're like, okay, top sirloin is going to have more protein than ribeye per calorie, and you make those choices, then you're good to go. It's a skill. It's a skill is all it is. I'm passionate about this stuff, even when it could be mundane.
No, I love it. It's great, and it's clear, comes through in the conviction that you have in what you're saying, as far as making sure people are getting who they think they're getting when they sign up to have someone help them with their fitness and nutrition. If someone wanted to hire a personal trainer, maybe what are some red flags to look for in a personal trainer? And what's a question that you absolutely have to make sure that you're asking to vet the person?
I want to think about this for a second because there's a lot of things I could say. Because there's there's got to be some context. And what I mean by that is I wouldn't recommend anybody just go start Googling personal trainers and then take what I say here and say, now I'm going to pick a personal trainer based on what Philip just said. I think when you pick somebody like that, it should come from some source of trust, which could be, word of mouth. It could be like if you listen to their podcast or if you're in their community or something like that.
Don't pick the personal trainer with the best SEO skills.
Yeah. That's the thing. Marketing is just so slick today, and with social media and everything, the best people on social media are often not the best coaches. Let's be honest, but they could be. Like you can't judge by that. Man, I want to say that it comes down to, do they listen to you? Are they tailoring it to you? And is it for you and your communication style? Like it comes down to the personal side of it, not necessarily to the content and the knowledge. You would hope that anybody's kind of worth their salt and has the certs and the background that they need, but really, are they right for you? Is the 22-year-old dude right for you as a 48-year-old, perimenopausal woman dealing with like thyroid issues? Is that the best fit? You know what I mean? So you got to trust them. You got to be able to talk to them, and they have to listen to you.
Is the licensing required to become a personal trainer enough to actually effectively train people?
I would say not. I would say you got to work with people to train people. So I'd rather have somebody who works with people without a personal training license. And there are actually a lot of trainers like that. There are a lot of coaches, there are a lot of nutrition coaches that don't have any cert because at least in the US, there's no legal requirement for it. So that's where it gets tricky, right? Because people would have like 20 letters after their name and not be worth a damn, right? And then somebody who's self-taught, who's gone through their own transformation and who's worked with clients for 10 years, may be an amazing coach. That's what makes it tricky, man. It makes it very difficult to find the right people in this space.
Well, I think it's good that you're doing your best to direct people to the right places, or offering the help that you can to those that you're able to pull in, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the purpose of you wanting to ask the question is. I just know that like all the traditional marketing and sales stuff just doesn't appeal to me. I don't like to convince people against their will, and I don't like to sell people on what I do. So for me, it's just like, find me on my podcast or community, hang out, talk to me, reach out. If you like me, let's talk. And then at some point there might be an exchange of money, but that's far down the line, you know?
No, the question purely just comes out of, it is hard to find a personal trainer that you can trust knows what they're doing in the age where everybody wants to be a fitness influencer that thinks they can train people, or has their $30 program ebook that you can buy, or has their cookbook that they're trying to sell you. It's like, I mean, this is not a plug, but like, I go on your website and there's like 10 to 15 literally free resources that anyone can just go download, because that's the point, to bring people. Like, yeah, the question was quite literally to know who to trust, because like I said, SEO can't be it.
I mean, let's flip it around. How do you know how to trust anyone that you get a service from, like a doctor or something else? I don't know, because when I think of a service where I'm not an expert in it, which would be most other things, if it's, you know, like, I don't know, doctors, maybe a terrible example because that whole industry is just screwed up. But even just like a contractor for my house, you got to trust them to some way. You have to have some level of confidence that they're going to get the job done well. And if you don't know them at all, that probability is low. Just, you're taking a risk. And so knowing somebody could, again, come from your network, come from having communicated with them, just the basics like that. That's my opinion. So don't just trust marketing, like you said. Yeah.
You've talked about it a couple times, but how big is the community factor when it comes to fitness?
I'm convinced it's bigger than I ever thought it was earlier, because I'm kind of a loner. I do stuff for myself a lot. I'm a DIY type of person. But when I look at my last 10 years of where I've made the most growth, it was, you know, with the support of others. And others could be a single person, like a mentor or a coach, or it could be multiple people. Or when I say community, it's kind of a loose term of, it could be one person from a collective of people who think and act a certain way, right? They have a certain body of knowledge or certain scholarly approach or method or whatever. There's a theory, self-determination theory, which has 3 components to it. One of those is relatedness. The idea that the people who are the most determined to get something done, so going back to like discipline, motivation, whatever you want to call it, have an element of connecting to other people doing the same thing. So that's when I think community is important. That's what we do on our podcast, right? That's why we create our networks. And that's why I have all my communities that I have.
What are the top 3 pieces of fitness advice that you think are the worst that you see handed out regularly? That was a terrible way to ask that question. What are the worst pieces of fitness advice you see handed out regularly?
Do you know how much I discombobulate my words all the time? No, that was good. The worst 3 pieces of advice, man. How do I pick just 3? I mean, there's the platitudes. I'm gonna categorize them because it's not just like individual pieces. There's platitudes, all the motivational platitudes. And, you know, I've been guilty of doing this here and there. If I post something on social and I'm like, you know, just get out there and go to the gym, you know, like shit like that. But it's the platitudes with no context, no guidance, no like help, right? Just, here, I'm going to motivate you with this nonsense. So that would be one. I think the second one is going to be leaving it up to you to kind of fill in the blanks of what a fitness person means when they say something. So like when I hear people say, just move or get an hour of activity a day or whatever it is, what does that mean? Like, Tell me what to do. What does that mean? Does that mean like just walk around my house? Does that mean I have to run? Does that mean I train? You know what I mean? So that, okay. And then I don't know, if I had to pick a third, I would just lump all of the call outs of specific foods as being bad. Like, I think that's just a problem. Almost every 99.999% of those I would push back on. The 0.0001% might be like trans fats 15 years ago, before they got all banned, right? They're banned. So what I'm saying is you could eat anything, and in the context of an overall healthy dietary pattern, it's fine. Seed oils, carbs. I don't know. Tell me all the boogeymen. You know all the boogeymen today. There's a whole bunch.
Oh yeah, I don't know.
Aspartame, right? Artificial sweetener. Have your diet soda. Like, if that keeps you sane, if you enjoy the taste and it prevents you like consuming other calories that you don't want right now, go for it.
I think there's this funny seesaw that I keep seeing on Twitter in particular of like all the one that keeps coming to mind when you say that is the like aspartame and diet sodas, and there's a bunch of the diet guys like telling people to drink diet soda, and there's a like 15 tweet thread on why you should replace your regular soda with diet soda. I think I included that point in a newsletter at one point way back when. But yeah, if it's like keeping you from consuming other calories, then by all means, like, honestly, the jury's still out on that one, and by the time we find out, who the hell knows. But
and then there's ridiculous stuff like broccoli. Like I probably, what's his name, Saladino. I shouldn't even say his name, but carnivore
what
guy. Like, broccoli's bad for you because it causes you to create some compound, and then when you look in context, it's ridiculous. Yeah,
I don't know. It pops up on my feed every now and then, and it's the purity spiral thing in the opposite direction, where you basically have to keep demonizing more and more things to the point where you're like literally just eating raw meat and eggs, and it's like, well, maybe I'm not listening to you anymore.
Totally agree, especially when you're funded by carnivore people or whatever, or some supplement company. Yeah.
The one thing I am actually interested in that's been on my list and is actually in my like library app that is getting returned in 3 days because I haven't opened it yet is there's a new book called Ultra Processed People that I keep meaning to read, that I don't know if you've had any touch points with, but I'm curious to dig in.
Well, I mean, so give me some context specifically. You have a question about it?
No, not a question, just more of a comment of like this. As far as like particular demonization of foods, and I'm on your team of, listen, everything in moderation and just get 80% whole foods. But I'm curious to like look into some of the potential quote unquote science in this book.
Yeah.
Because it's
I'm looking at it right now on Amazon, right? Ultra processed people, science behind food that isn't food. I mean, yeah, if you look at the average American, they eat like 70% processed foods. So if you can eat 20% processed foods, that's a huge step change in the right direction. If you want to take it to 10% or you want to take it to 5%, go for it. But you can't take it past the point of impracticality. That's my argument, because if you take it past that point, now you're going to either be miserable and feel like you're constantly fighting yourself and just like have a miserable existence for decades, or you're going to lash out the other way because you can't handle the emotional strain and the mental strain and the moral strain, honestly, we put on ourselves of this good bad dichotomy. And now you binge the other direction, or you say, it doesn't work for me. And it's not sustainable. The magic S word I use all the time, and I think I haven't used it the whole interview.
Yeah, that's the agency part of the self-determination theory that you're talking about, right?
Agency. Yes. Yeah. And what's the third part? The third part is competency. Yes. Yeah. Competence. Yeah. Yep.
I've heard you refer to this as additive nutrition. What's additive nutrition?
It's adding in instead of cutting out. That's all it is. So I mentioned the protein and fiber earlier. If you just looked at your day and assessed what you ate, I'm guessing most people listening, like 2 or 3 of your meals have little to no protein. So now if you all of a sudden added in a whole steak or a whole bowl of Greek yogurt, what would that do to the plate? Because you probably wouldn't eat the same amount. You wouldn't just eat that plus what you were eating. If you have a bag of chips in the afternoon, but now you get a bowl of cottage cheese, chances are you're going to have one or the other. So it's a nice way to crowd things out and get to that 80-20 without feeling like you're restricting.
If you only had 10 exercises to target your full body for the rest of your life, what would they be?
10. That's a big number. That's plenty. All right. We're going to go with, I mean, do I have to say like a specific type of squat? Because I could do that. But I'm going to say a barbell squat, a barbell bench, a barbell press, and a barbell deadlift. Those are 4. And then I'm going to say, let's see, let's do the circuit of the body, probably 1 for each body part. So for the back, we're going to go with a row. So that's 5. For the legs, we're going to go with, that's a hard one. I'm going to go with Romanian deadlifts for the hamstrings, and probably add in some sort of quad dominant movement for the quads. So leg press for that. All right. That leaves me 3. So that's going to have to be, curls, some line triceps extensions, and something for the abs. Just to round out the whole body.
There you go.
For the abs, I don't know. I could pick anything. They're all interchangeable. More or less.
Okay, this is a sort of tangential question based on the finishing on the abs there. What's something that you would recommend for someone who finds that they're having like weak wrists, weak ankles, smaller parts of your body where you feel like you're not limited by the actual muscle itself and you're limited by the supporting skeletal or musculature in
connective tissue?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it depends on where it's coming from. Like if you're 85, that's a different reason than if you're 40, honestly. So like there's what we call special populations, right? In that case, there may be some sort of rehab protocol you need to build up to doing regular lifting. But for the majority of the population, the reason I like strength training and heavy lifting is I feel like it addresses all the aspects of fitness, including joint health, mobility, flexibility, and people will make excuses for that, right? They'll say, I have bad knees, or I have a bad back, or I have bad ankles. And often it just comes down to form and starting light enough and then building. Because if you can sit to a box, you can squat with a barbell and then eventually squat with a barbell heavy. You just have to build over there. Now, if your mobility is just so limited because of your ankles that you can't even get past 20 degrees, there's alterations for that. One is like squat shoes. Maybe you just need a little bit elevated heels. The other could be, using a band between a rack. The other could be using a very high box and then working your way down over time and lowering the box. So I think mobility, flexibility can all be enhanced by strength outside of special populations.
Are there any parts of fitness and nutrition outside of carbs are bad that you don't think are intuitive or common sense to people if they were to think hard enough?
That are not intuitive or common sense, but work. Okay, yeah. I think the whole understanding of fat loss and cardio is a big one, because people think that moving more burns more calories and therefore you need to move more and eat less. Like that's the common mantra, right? When in reality, our bodies are very adaptive. So the more you move, especially past a certain point of intensity, like with running or some sort of intense cardio, the more your body gets a signal that, hey, this mode of movement is important for you. And so I'm going to conserve energy for it and become really good at it. And so if you become good at running, guess what happens? You burn fewer calories. Now, I'm not saying you burn fewer. I'm saying the increase is less and less.
As a percentage of
As a percentage, right? Now there's, I don't know if you're familiar with the book Burn or Herman Poncer and his work, but
I got recommended by a friend a couple of years back and never picked it up. But yeah.
It's a good one. It's a good one. I think you have to take some of it with a grain of salt because he's not in the world of like lifting and nutrition. He's more of a like anthropologist, or he's a researcher of human populations. But it's fascinating because he came up with what's called the constrained energy model, which contrasts with the additive energy model. So the additive energy model is the traditional model, which looks just like a straight line. The more you move, the more you burn. What he did is he studied populations around the world, including the Hadza, which is a famous tribe that you hear about all the time. They're one of the remaining hunter-gatherer tribes. But he studied, the blue zone populations, Europe, the French, obviously Western populations, Asia, and all over the place. And what they did is they had a doubly labeled water experiment, where it's this water with I don't know what it has, not deuterium. I don't know what it has, some extra ions or something. I'm not a chemist. So it's a special water. When you drink it and then you measure the urine, you could actually measure your metabolic rate very accurately. It's incredible. So yeah, they had hunter-gatherer people drinking this stuff. And what they found is no matter where you were or how active you were, all humans of similar body composition have roughly the same metabolism, which was mind-blowing, because then people took that to the extreme and they said, oh, does that mean you don't have to exercise? Because what he was saying was, instead of the additive model where it's a straight line, it goes up for a while, but once you get past a certain point, it starts to level out. And it levels out because your body is now taking from its own resources by downregulating hormones, by downregulating mitochondria. Like everything just kind of slows down and gets more efficient. And so and that happens more in a diet as well, right? Metabolic adaptation. So when you take all that together and people say, I'm going to run a lot to burn fat, or even worse, Blake, lifters who say, now I'm going to go into fat loss, I'm going to stop lifting. Like, what are you doing? The only way to lose fat is to hold on to the muscle so that the weight you lose is fat. Otherwise, you're going to lose muscle. That's one of the biggest things people misunderstand, is that whole relationship. So long story short, you don't have to do much cardio. You do have to train by lifting weights. And then you have to use nutrition to moderate the change in weight.
I have one final question that I like to ask all my guests. And that's, what's the last thing that you changed your mind about?
The last thing I changed my mind about? Oh, I change my mind all the time, and yet I'm decisive. Isn't that an irony? Okay. So right before we recorded this podcast, I went downstairs to grab a glass of water, because in your intake form it says make sure to have some water. So I'm like, good point, because I podcast and I forget to do that. And I'm in a fat loss phase right now. I've been in it for maybe a month after 9 months of building, and the calories are tight. So my stomach or my brain was telling me I was hungry, but I know it's emotional hunger. And my wife made this amazing dinner that I could just smell, and it's getting the hunger signals going. Should I get a snack? I was this close, and then I changed my mind. I'm not going to get a snack because I'm going to enjoy that dinner when we're done.
I love it.
Okay.
Philip, I'm grateful for you. All your stuff is great. If we want to send people to find it, where should we send them?
The podcast, Wits and Weights podcast. And then if you want all my other stuff, go to witsandweights.com.
Perfect. I appreciate you taking the time to hang out with me this afternoon, and catch you on the next one.
You bring out the feistiness in me. Thank you, Blake.